Yeah. I'll call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to resume the call that I was so rudely interrupted by the Minister some time ago. I was debating Part 1. I was up to Clause 12. We were discussing the ability of Housing New Zealand to review eligibility for a Housing New Zealand home. And I did ask a number of questions of the Minister which remain unanswered around the kind of data sharing that would be going on between government departments as part of these provisions. And I would really welcome the Minister and the Chair taking up the mantle and responding to those questions which still lay on the table. Mr. Chair, in particular, I want to go back to this issue of housing insecurity, because of course the Minister has said his rationale for all of these parts, predominantly for Part 1, which allows an ongoing reviewable tenancy essentially, is that his claim that there is, of course, these high waiting lists and extreme demand on our social housing and our state houses. And that is not in question on this side, but our response is simply that we must build more housing. The Minister's response, however, is to actually apply an additional layer of housing insecurity, which is already a significant issue. If you look at, in particular, our poor areas of Auckland, for instance, there is an incredible turnover of students in our low decile schools as a consequence of insecure tenancy. And if we're now doing that to our state housing, that creates a whole additional layer of social issues as a consequence. So that was a point I wanted to specifically raise. But there are other forms of housing insecurity, Mr. Chair, that have been perpetuated by this Minister at present. I am based in central Auckland. I'm a List MP there. Recently, a number of tenants in Spring Street flats in central Auckland, where there is really a limited number of social and state housing available, those residents at Spring Street flats have been given letters to tell them that Housing New Zealand is currently assessing those properties. There is a chance that they may be moved on, but there's no real final view as to what's going to happen. Now, Mr. Chair, I wrote to the Minister asking for assurances around that process, and his first response back was to slate me as not being the local elected member and therefore questioning my right to ask such questions. I thought that was disappointing. Secondly, he didn't give really any assurances. Now, I point to that example because those tenants are now in a state of complete insecurity, and actually that's what we're about to do to all state house tenants through these reforms, is put them on constant notice that at any time they may go through a review. And that review process is set out in Part 1. It's going from 57 AD. It starts talking about, for instance, and C and B, how Housing New Zealand may investigate circumstances relevant to continued eligibility. And as I've said, Mr. Speaker, and there are quite a number of provisions in that regard, it includes the power of Housing New Zealand set out in Section 58 for Housing New Zealand to ask any person whose circumstances it may investigate any relevant questions it thinks fit, and B, may ask any person whose circumstances it may investigate to verify by statutory declaration basically anything that's applicable as they determine it to their circumstances and their eligibility. Now, Mr. Chair, I would really ask the Minister and the Chair if he could explain to the House whether or not there will be any guidelines set out around Housing New Zealand, the way they enforce this particular section. Now, the reason I ask that question is because I've seen how work and income operate in this regard, and that is who will be carrying out assessments in the future. And the kinds of questions that they ask clients go well beyond the scope of what they should be questioning clients over. Now, of course, everyone in this House would agree that it's important that we make sure that people comply with the rules that are set out for those who are in need versus those who are trying to defraud the system. But we have always come from the approach that in doing so, that can be balanced by also as having a system, though, that is weighted in the notion of dignity. And my concern is that more and more entities like Work and Income, under the leadership of Paula Bennett, have moved away from that as a starting point. So I'd like to ask the Minister whether or not, Mr Chair, he can set out whether or not there will be guidelines. Mr Chair. Mr Chair.
Jackie Dean.
Mr
Question
Chair.
be now
Call
put.
Moana Mackie.
I want to